The beep of the cardiac monitor was the only company I had for the first 3 weeks. No flowers, no visitors, just me tubes running through my body, and the constant hum of machines keeping me alive after the construction crane collapsed on my crew. When I finally regained consciousness, the nurse told me dozens of people had called asking about my condition. But my parents, they never showed. Not until they heard about the lawsuit settlement. Then suddenly they remembered they had a son named Merle. David immediately contacted federal law enforcement agencies because the scheme involved mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges that fell under federal jurisdiction. Working with David and federal investigators, I began building a comprehensive case against my parents and their accomplices while maintaining the pretense of cooperation with their scheme. This required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, medical professionals, and legal experts who were documenting the various crimes being committed. The investigation quickly revealed that my parents' activities were part of a larger pattern of exploitation targeting accident victims and their families. Private investigator Rachel Kim, who specialized in financial fraud cases, uncovered evidence that Robert and Linda had been using my Social Security number to open credit accounts and apply for loans since the accident occurred. They had apparently been presenting themselves as my authorized representatives to various financial institutions and had successfully obtained several $1,000s in credit that they had no intention or ability to repay. This identity theft was particularly sophisticated because they had been using their access to my personal information, combined with knowledge of my medical situation, to convince lenders that they were acting on my behalf during my recovery. Several credit card companies had approved applications submitted by my parents who had claimed that I was unable to manage my own finances due to the severity of my injuries. Emma arrived from Seattle with additional documentation that proved invaluable to the investigation. She had been collecting evidence of our parents' financial crimes for several years, hoping that someday there would be an opportunity to hold them accountable for their actions. Her files included bank records, fraudulent documents, and correspondence that demonstrated a long history of financial manipulation and exploitation of family members. The evidence Emma provided included documentation of how Robert and Linda had systematically drained our grandmother's savings account during her final months of life. They had used a combination of forged signatures, unauthorized withdrawals, and manipulated power of attorney documents to steal nearly $40,000 from an elderly woman who trusted them to help manage her affairs. The money had been used to pay off their personal debts and finance a luxury vacation rather than covering grandmother's medical expenses as they had claimed. Similar patterns emerged in their treatment of Uncle Frank, who had been convinced to invest his retirement savings in what Robert had described as a guaranteed real estate investment opportunity. The investment had been entirely fictitious, with Robert and Linda simply stealing Frank's money while providing him with fake documentation about the supposed returns on his investment. Frank had lost his life savings and had been forced to continue working well past retirement age to survive financially. Dr. Gregory Walsh's involvement in the conspiracy was thoroughly documented through recorded phone conversations and email communications that Rachel Kim had obtained through legal channels. Dr. Walsh had explicitly agreed to provide a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation that would support the guardianship petition in exchange for a fee of $5,000. The conversations revealed that he had never examined me and had no legitimate medical basis for his planned conclusions about my mental capacity. The recordings also captured Dr. Walsh providing detailed instructions to my parents about how to create evidence of my supposed mental incapacity. He had advised them to document incidents where I appeared confused, emotional, or unable to make decisions even if they had to exaggerate or fabricate such incidents. He had also suggested that they could claim my pain medications were affecting my judgment, despite the fact that my medical records showed I was taking only minimal pain relief medication and was clearly mentally competent. Federal investigators were particularly interested in the connection between my parents and Titan Industrial Equipment representatives. The investigation revealed that Titan had been systematically identifying accident victims whose families might be vulnerable to financial manipulation and had been offering payments to family members who could convince victims to accept reduced settlements. Amanda Foster, the Titan representative who had visited me in the hospital, had been in regular contact with my parents since shortly after the accident occurred. Phone records showed dozens of calls between Amanda and my parents during which they had discussed strategies for convincing me to accept a settlement offer that was substantially below the actual value of my claims. Titan had apparently offered to pay my parents a percentage of any savings they achieved by convincing me to settle for less than the full value of my case. This arrangement constituted criminal conspiracy to commit fraud on multiple levels. Titan was attempting to manipulate victims through their own family member mental health. The message arrived at 2 a.m. when I was alone with the beeping monitors and the antiseptic smell of the hospital. My co-workers from Morrison Construction became my real family during this period. Tommy Rodriguez visited every other day, his left arm still in a sling from his own injuries. He brought updates from the job site news about the investigation into the crane failure and genuine concern for my recovery. Other crew members rotated through bringing candy bars from the vending machines and updates about their own families. Through these conversations, I learned that Morrison Construction was facing massive lawsuits related to the accident. The crane had been manufactured by Titan Industrial Equipment, and preliminary investigations suggested that a known hydraulic defect had caused the failure. The company had allegedly received multiple reports of similar malfunctions, but had failed to issue proper warnings or recalls. This information would prove crucial in the coming months, but at the time, I was focused primarily on regaining basic functions like sitting up without assistance and breathing without supplemental oxygen. The physical therapy process began 3 weeks after the accident when my medical team determined that my bones had healed sufficiently to begin movement. Marcus Jefferson, a former Marine who had lost his own leg in Afghanistan, became my physical therapist and eventually one of my closest friends. Marcus had a direct, no-nonsense approach that pushed me beyond what I thought were my limits, while never making me feel pitied or diminished. During one of our early sessions, as I struggled to move from the hospital bed to a wheelchair, Marcus asked about my family support system. When I explained that my parents hadn't visited, he paused his instruction and looked at me seriously. He told me that during his own recovery from his war injuries, he had learned to distinguish between people who truly cared about his welfare and those who were simply going through socially expected motions. He suggested that my parents' absence might actually be providing me with valuable information about their priorities and character. The medical bills were accumulating rapidly, creating a secondary source of anxiety beyond my physical recovery. My construction job provided basic health insurance, but the coverage was insufficient for the extensive surgeries and extended hospital stay required by my injuries. The bills already exceeded $200,000, and my disability payments from the insurance company barely covered my monthly rent and basic expenses. This financial pressure added urgency to the legal discussions that were beginning to emerge around the crane manufacturer's liability. 4 weeks after the accident, as I was learning to navigate short distances with a walker, a visitor arrived who would change the trajectory of my entire situation. David Harrison was a personal injury attorney specializing in construction accidents and product liability cases. He was a tall man in his early 50s with graying hair and a serious demeanor that immediately conveyed competence and experience. David had been contacted by Tommy Rodriguez, who felt that the crew members deserved legal representation in pursuing compensation from Titan Industrial Equipment. He explained that similar crane failures had occurred at construction sites across the country, and there was substantial evidence that the manufacturer had been aware of the hydraulic defect for several years without taking appropriate corrective action. The legal situation was complex, involving multiple potential defendants and various types of claims. Morrison Construction was cooperating fully with the investigation and had already filed claims against Titan Industrial Equipment for damages related to the accident. The families of the 3 workers who had died were pursuing wrongful death lawsuits. As a severely injured survivor, I had grounds for substantial personal injury claims based on my medical expenses, lost wages, permanent disability, and pain and suffering. David spent nearly 2 hours explaining the legal process and the potential timeline for resolution. He estimated that between the personal injury claims and the product liability case against Titan Industrial Equipment, my total settlement could reach several $1,000,000. However, he cautioned that these cases often took years to resolve, especially when major corporations were fighting to minimize their financial exposure. During our conversation, David mentioned that representatives from various insurance companies and corporate legal teams had been making inquiries about the injured workers. This was standard procedure, as companies often preferred to settle claims quickly rather than face prolonged litigation and potential jury awards. He advised me to be extremely cautious about any settlement offers that might come my way, as initial offers were typically far below the actual value of legitimate claims. The next day, I received an unexpected visit from Amanda Foster, a well-dressed woman in her 40s, who introduced herself as a victim services coordinator for Titan Industrial Equipment. She carried an expensive leather briefcase and spoke with the polished tone of someone accustomed to corporate negotiations. Amanda expressed deep sympathy for my injuries and assured me that Titan was committed to taking full responsibility for the accident. She presented what she described as a good faith gesture of $50,000, which she said I could receive immediately if I signed a simple release form. Amanda explained that this payment would help with my immediate medical expenses, while the larger insurance claims were being processed. She emphasized that this was not a settlement, but rather an advance payment that demonstrated Titan's commitment to supporting the injured workers. David had specifically warned me about exactly this type of approach. The release form that Amanda wanted me to sign would have prevented me from pursuing any additional legal action against Titan Industrial Equipment. $50,000 might have seemed substantial while I was lying in a hospital bed worried about medical bills, but it represented a tiny fraction of what my legitimate claims were worth. I politely declined Amanda's offer and informed her that all future communications should go through my attorney. My physical therapy sessions with Marcus were gradually increasing in intensity and duration. The titanium rods and screws in my pelvis were holding well, and my lung function was returning to normal. Marcus introduced me to other patients who were recovering from serious injuries, creating an informal support network of people who understood the challenges of rebuilding physical capabilities after trauma. One of these patients was Rebecca Stone, a teacher who had been severely injured in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. Rebecca was further along in her recovery and shared valuable insights about navigating insurance companies, disability payments, and the emotional challenges of extended rehabilitation. She also warned me about family members and friends who might emerge from the background once legal settlements became a possibility. This conversation proved prescient when Janet mentioned that my parents had called the hospital, asking about my condition and potential discharge dates. They had also inquired about my legal representation and whether there had been any discussions about financial settlements. When Janet asked if they wanted to speak with me directly, they said they would visit in person soon. The investigation into the crane failure was producing alarming evidence of corporate negligence. David shared reports from federal safety investigators indicating that Titan Industrial Equipment had received more than 40 reports of hydraulic failures in cranes with the same model and manufacturing year as the one that had collapsed at our job site. Internal company documents showed that engineers had identified the defect and recommended a recall, but executives had decided that the cost of the recall exceeded the potential liability from accidents. This pattern of prioritizing profits over worker safety was exactly the type of evidence that could result in substantial punitive damages in addition to compensation for my actual losses. David explained that punitive damages were designed to punish companies for particularly egregious misconduct and deter similar behavior in the future. In cases involving corporate cover-ups of known safety defects, juries often awarded punitive damages that exceeded the actual compensatory damages by substantial margins. Morrison Construction was also providing valuable cooperation in the legal case. The company's safety records showed that they had followed all required maintenance protocols for the crane and had no reason to suspect any defects. Jake Williams, the crane operator, had 22 years of experience and had never been involved in any accidents. The failure had been sudden and complete, consistent with a catastrophic mechanical defect rather than operator error or maintenance issues. During this period, I began to notice changes in my relationship with the hospital staff. Nurses and doctors who had initially treated me as just another patient were now approaching me with a different level of attention. Word had apparently spread that I was represented by a prominent attorney and potentially facing a substantial settlement. While most of the staff remained professional and caring, I sensed an underlying awareness that my situation had significant financial implications. The most disturbing aspect of this attention came when Dr. Patricia Wells, the hospital's patient services coordinator, mentioned that several people had been calling to inquire about my condition and legal situation. Some of these calls were from legitimate sources like insurance companies and my attorney's office, but others seemed to be from individuals who had no clear reason for requesting information about my case. When I asked for more details, Dr. Wells explained that they had received calls from people claiming to be family members who wanted updates on my medical condition and legal proceedings. The hospital's privacy policies prevented them from sharing information with anyone not specifically authorized by me, but the volume and persistence of these inquiries was unusual. This information created a sense of unease about who might be monitoring my situation and what their motivations might be. My disability payments from Morrison Construction's insurance company were covering my basic living expenses, but just barely. My apartment rent was $800 per month, and combined with utilities, food, and other necessities, I was spending nearly every dollar I received. The potential for a substantial legal settlement offered hope for financial security, but David repeatedly emphasized that these cases could take several years to resolve. The families of my coworkers who had died in the accident were facing even more severe financial pressure. Miguel Santos had been the primary breadwinner for his wife and 4 children, and his death had left them in desperate circumstances. Kevin Thompson's widow was pregnant with their first child and facing the prospect of raising the baby alone while dealing with funeral expenses and lost income. Danny Walsh had been supporting his elderly parents, who now had no source of financial assistance. These human costs of the corporate negligence made the legal case about much more than just financial compensation. David was coordinating with the attorneys representing the other families to ensure that our combined legal strategy would maximize pressure on Titan Industrial Equipment to accept full responsibility for their actions. The company's attempts to minimize their liability through quick, lowball settlements demonstrated their awareness of the serious legal exposure they faced. 6 weeks after the accident, on a Tuesday morning while I was working with Marcus on walking exercises, Janet informed me that my parents had finally arrived for a visit. Robert and Linda walked into my hospital room, carrying a small bouquet of flowers that looked like they had been purchased from a gas station convenience store. Their appearance was casual, as if they were stopping by after running other errands rather than visiting their son who had nearly died in a construction accident. My father, Robert, was a thin man in his mid-50s with thinning brown hair and a mustache that made him look older than his actual age. He worked as a supervisor at a warehouse distribution center, a job that provided steady but modest income. My mother, Linda, was shorter and had gained weight over the years with blonde hair that came from a bottle and a tendency to dress in bright colors that didn't flatter her complexion. She worked part-time at a department store in the customer service department. Their first words weren't expressions of concern about my health or relief that I had survived. Instead, Robert immediately launched into an elaborate explanation of why they hadn't been able to visit earlier. He claimed that his job had been requiring extensive overtime due to a major inventory project. Linda added that she had been dealing with a complicated situation involving their neighbor's barking dog and had been too stressed to focus on anything else. These explanations felt hollow and unconvincing, especially given that I had been in intensive care for 3 weeks, and my survival had been uncertain for much of that time. However, what truly revealed their priorities was the direction their conversation took within the first 10 minutes of their visit. After asking a few perfunctory questions about my injuries and recovery, Robert shifted the topic to the legal case and potential financial settlements. He mentioned that he had been researching similar construction accidents online and had discovered that settlements often reached millions of dollars. Linda added that they had been discussing how best to help me manage any money I might receive, given my inexperience with significant financial decisions. The irony of this concern was profound, considering that my parents had filed for bankruptcy twice during my teenage years due to their inability to manage their own finances responsibly. They had a history of spending beyond their means, accumulating credit card debt, and making impulsive purchases that strained their budget. The idea that they viewed themselves as qualified to provide financial guidance was both absurd and insulting. As our conversation continued, Robert presented what he described as a practical solution to the challenges I would face during my recovery and beyond. He suggested that I move back into their house so they could provide care and assistance while I completed my rehabilitation. This arrangement, he argued, would save money on my apartment rent and ensure that I had family support during my recovery period. Linda enthusiastically endorsed this plan, adding that they had already begun converting their spare bedroom into a space suitable for someone with mobility limitations. She described the modifications they were planning, including grab bars in the bathroom and a ramp for the front steps. Their level of detailed planning was impressive, especially considering that they hadn't bothered to visit me until 6 weeks after the accident. The conversation took an even more disturbing turn when Robert produced a folder containing several printed documents that he described as a family agreement to formalize our mutual responsibilities during my recovery. The documents were handwritten, legal forms that appeared to have been downloaded from an online template service. The agreement outlined their obligations to provide care and housing, but more importantly, it specified my obligations to contribute to household expenses and allow them to assist with managing any legal settlements or insurance payments. The financial provisions of this agreement were particularly concerning. Robert had calculated that my fair share of household expenses would be $1,500 per month, which was nearly double my current apartment rent. Additionally, the agreement included language giving them authority to make financial decisions on my behalf if I was unable or unwilling to manage my affairs responsibly. This authority would include access to my bank accounts, insurance settlements, and legal communications. When I expressed reluctance to sign these documents immediately, Linda became emotional and accused me of being ungrateful for their willingness to sacrifice their own comfort to help me. She reminded me of all the times they had supported me during my childhood and suggested that family members should be willing to help each other during difficult periods. Robert added that their financial advisor had recommended formalizing these arrangements to ensure that everyone's interests were protected. The mention of a financial advisor was particularly alarming, as it suggested that my parents had been discussing my potential settlement with outside parties before even visiting me in the hospital. When I asked for more details about this advisor, Robert became evasive and said they had simply been seeking general information about how to help family members manage large financial settlements. During this visit, I began to recall patterns from my childhood that I had previously rationalized or forgotten. My parents had frequently borrowed money from me starting when I was 10 years old and had received birthday cash from relatives. They always promised to repay these loans, but the money never materialized. When I worked part-time jobs during high school, they charged me rent that was disproportionate to my income and our family's actual financial needs. Most significantly, I remembered how they had handled the death of my grandmother Ruth 3 years earlier. Grandma Ruth had specifically mentioned in her will that she wanted her modest savings to be divided among her grandchildren, including me. However, my parents had convinced her to change the will before her death, arguing that they needed the money to pay for her final medical expenses. After her death, instead of using the inherited money for medical bills, they had purchased a new car and taken a vacation to Las Vegas. This pattern of financial manipulation and self-serving behavior was now being applied to my own crisis situation. My parents viewed my potential legal settlement not as compensation for my pain and suffering, but as an opportunity to improve their own financial circumstances. Their elaborate plans for my care and housing were clearly designed to provide them with access to money rather than to support my actual recovery needs. The visit concluded with Robert leaving the documents for me to review, and Linda suggesting that they would return the following week for my signature. They emphasized that time was important because the legal process would be moving forward and financial decisions would need to be made soon. Before leaving, Robert mentioned that several other family members had been asking about my condition and the legal case suggesting that news of my potential settlement was spreading through our extended family network. After they left, I spent considerable time thinking about their sudden interest in my welfare and their detailed financial planning. Marcus, who had been working with other patients during my parents' visit, returned to find me visibly upset and distracted. When I explained what had transpired, he suggested that I might want to discuss the situation with someone who specialized in family dynamics during medical crises. That evening, Janet introduced me to Patricia Wong, a hospital social worker who specialized in helping patients navigate complicated family situations during extended medical treatment. Patricia had extensive experience with cases where family members emerged during legal settlements or insurance payouts, and she immediately recognized the concerning elements of my parents' behavior. Patricia explained that financial exploitation of medical patients by their own family members was more common than most people realized. She described typical patterns of behavior that included sudden increased attention after periods of neglect, elaborate plans for care that primarily benefited the caregivers, and attempts to gain legal control over the patient's financial decisions. My parents' actions fit these patterns precisely. More disturbing was Patricia's information about the legal mechanisms that unscrupulous family members sometimes use to gain control over medical patients' finances. She mentioned that some families attempted to have patients declared mentally incompetent or unable to manage their own affairs, particularly when significant settlements or insurance payouts were involved. These legal processes could be initiated by family members who claimed to be concerned about the patient's welfare but were actually motivated by financial gain. The possibility that my parents might attempt to have me declared incompetent had never occurred to me, but Patricia's explanation made their behavior seem even more calculated and threatening. The documents they wanted me to sign could potentially be used as evidence that I had acknowledged needing assistance with financial decisions. Their claims about my inexperience managing money could be presented as evidence of my incapacity. That night, lying in my hospital bed listening to the familiar sounds of monitors and medical equipment, I realized that my recovery would involve more than just healing from physical injuries. I was going to need to protect myself from people who viewed my trauma as their opportunity for financial gain. The people who should have been my strongest supporters during this crisis were instead planning to exploit my vulnerability for their own benefit. Rather than confronting my parents directly about their obvious intentions, I decided to gather more information about their activities while pretending to consider their proposals. This strategy required careful acting on my part as I needed to appear cooperative without actually agreeing to anything that would give them control over my finances or legal decisions. When Robert and Linda returned the following Tuesday, I told them I was impressed by their thoroughness in planning for my care, but needed time to review the documents with my attorney before signing anything. I explained that David had insisted on reviewing any agreements that might affect my legal case, which was a reasonable explanation that they couldn't openly object to without revealing their true priorities. However, I had secretly prepared for this conversation by purchasing a small digital recording device that I kept concealed in my hospital bed. Patricia had suggested that documenting their actual words and motivations might be important if legal intervention became necessary to protect my interests. The recording device was voice-activated and could capture several hours of conversation without detection. During this visit, my parents were more direct about their expectations and timeline. Robert explained that they had already been in contact with someone he described as a guardianship specialist who could help streamline the process of managing my financial affairs. He claimed this was a standard precaution that many families took when dealing with large settlements, particularly when the injured person might not have experience handling significant amounts of money. Linda added that their financial advisor had recommended moving quickly because legal settlements could be frozen or delayed if there were questions about the recipient's ability to manage the funds responsibly. She suggested that having proper family oversight in place would actually protect my interests and ensure that the settlement process moved forward smoothly. These explanations contained enough partial truths to sound plausible, but Patricia had already educated me about the actual legal processes involved in settlements and guardianship proceedings. The reality was that competent adults did not need family oversight to receive legal settlements, and the presence of such arrangements could actually complicate the settlement process by introducing unnecessary legal complications. The most revealing part of this conversation occurred when my parents thought I was sleeping. They had been discussing their plans in hushed tones for several minutes, when they apparently decided I was unconscious. During this period, the recording device captured a conversation that fully exposed their motivations and intentions. Robert told Linda that their contact at the guardianship attorney's office had explained that they needed medical evidence of my diminished mental capacity to successfully petition for guardianship. He mentioned that they had already arranged for Dr. Gregory Walsh, a psychiatrist who was a family friend, to conduct an evaluation that would support their petition. Dr. Walsh had apparently agreed to document concerns about my ability to make sound financial decisions due to the trauma of the accident and the side effects of pain medications. Linda responded by expressing concerns about the timeline, noting that my physical recovery was progressing faster than they had anticipated, and that I seemed more alert and mentally sharp than they had hoped. She worried that if I fully recovered before they could establish legal guardianship, they would lose their opportunity to access the settlement money. Most disturbing was Robert's response that they needed to move forward with the guardianship petition immediately before I had time to organize any opposition. He mentioned that once the petition was filed, I would be legally required to respond through an attorney, which would cost money I didn't currently have. He calculated that the legal process could take several months, during which time they could potentially gain temporary guardianship authority that would give them access to my settlement funds. This conversation revealed that my parents were not simply hoping to benefit from my settlement, but were actively planning to take legal control of my finances against my will. They were conspiring with a corrupt psychiatrist to create false medical evidence and using their knowledge of my financial limitations to prevent me from mounting an effective legal defense. The next morning, I immediately contacted David Harrison and Patricia Wong to report what I had discovered. David was alarmed by the recording and explained that guardianship fraud was a serious crime that could result in federal charges if it involved attempting to steal legal settlements. He recommended that we immediately begin documenting my mental competency through formal medical evaluations and psychological testing. Patricia arranged for Dr. Michael Chen, the hospital's chief of psychiatry, to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of my mental capacity and cognitive function. Dr. Chen was aware of the potential guardianship threat and structured his evaluation to create detailed documentation of my mental competence and decision-making abilities. The evaluation included psychological testing, cognitive assessments, and interviews with medical staff who had observed my behavior during my hospital stay. Meanwhile, I reached out to my sister Emma, who lived in Seattle and had been largely absent from my life for several years due to conflicts with our parents. Emma was 2 years older than me and had moved across the country after college, specifically to distance herself from Robert and Linda's financial manipulation and emotional drama. When I explained my situation, she immediately understood the threat and offered to help in any way possible. Emma revealed information about our parents' history that I had never known. She explained that they had attempted similar financial manipulation with other family members, including our elderly Uncle Frank and our grandmother Ruth. In both cases, they had used combinations of emotional manipulation, false legal documents, and corrupt professional accomplices to gain access to other people's money. Uncle Frank had lost nearly $30,000 from his retirement savings after Robert convinced him to invest in a fraudulent business opportunity. Our grandmother Ruth had been pressured into changing her will multiple times during her final years with Robert and Linda, using various tactics to ensure that they received the maximum possible inheritance. Emma had tried to intervene in both situations, but had been unsuccessful due to the victim's reluctance to believe that family members would deliberately exploit them. Emma also provided crucial information about Dr. Gregory Walsh, the psychiatrist who was planning to evaluate me for the guardianship petition. Dr. Walsh had lost his medical license in Oregon 3 years earlier due to ethical violations involving fraudulent disability evaluations. He had relocated to Arizona and obtained a new license, but his practice was primarily focused on providing questionable medical opinions for legal cases rather than legitimate psychiatric treatment. Armed with this information, David began investigating Dr. Walsh's background and discovered a pattern of providing fraudulent medical evaluations in exchange for payment from people seeking to exploit legal and insurance systems. David contacted the Arizona Medical Board to report Dr. Walsh's planned involvement in my case and requested an investigation into his professional conduct. During this period, my parents continued their visits and pressure for me to sign their guardianship documents. However, their behavior became increasingly suspicious and manipulative as they sensed my reluctance to cooperate. Robert began suggesting that my injury had affected my thinking more than I realized and that I wasn't capable of making sound decisions about my future. Linda added that my refusal to accept their help demonstrated poor judgment that could jeopardize my legal settlement. These accusations were particularly ironic given that I was simultaneously working with my attorney on complex legal strategies, managing my own medical care decisions, and coordinating with multiple healthcare professionals. My cognitive function was clearly intact, as evidenced by my ability to navigate these complicated situations effectively. However, my parents' willingness to make false claims about my mental capacity demonstrated their commitment to their fraudulent scheme. The pressure intensified when Robert mentioned that they had already filed preliminary paperwork with the court system and that a hearing date had been scheduled for the following month. He claimed that this was simply a formality to establish their legal authority to help me, but David's research revealed that they had actually filed a formal guardianship petition alleging that I was mentally incompetent and unable to manage my own affairs. The guardianship petition included false statements about my medical condition, fabricated claims about my inability to make rational decisions, and fraudulent assertions about my need for constant supervision. The document had been prepared by an attorney who specialized in what David described as predatory guardianship cases where unscrupulous family members used legal processes to steal money from vulnerable relatives. Most alarming was the discovery that my parents had been meeting with representatives from Titan Industrial Equipment, the crane manufacturer facing the lawsuit. David's investigation revealed that Titan had been systematically contacting family members of accident victims to negotiate reduced settlements in exchange for immediate cash payments. My parents had apparently been in discussion with Titan about accepting a significantly reduced settlement that would benefit the company while providing them with immediate access to money. This revelation transformed my situation from a family conflict into a criminal conspiracy involving multiple parties attempting to defraud me of my legitimate legal settlement. David immediately contacted federal law enforcement agencies because the scheme involved mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges that fell under federal jurisdiction. Working with David and federal investigators, I began building a comprehensive case against my parents and their accomplices while maintaining the pretense of cooperation with their scheme. This required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, medical professionals, and legal experts who were documenting the various crimes being committed. The investigation quickly revealed that my parents' activities were part of a larger pattern of exploitation targeting accident victims and their families. Private investigator Rachel Kim, who specialized in financial fraud cases, uncovered evidence that Robert and Linda had been using my Social Security number to open credit accounts and apply for loans since the accident occurred. They had apparently been presenting themselves as my authorized representatives to various financial institutions and had successfully obtained several $1,000s in credit that they had no intention or ability to repay. This identity theft was particularly sophisticated because they had been using their access to my personal information, combined with knowledge of my medical situation, to convince lenders that they were acting on my behalf during my recovery. Several credit card companies had approved applications submitted by my parents who had claimed that I was unable to manage my own finances due to the severity of my injuries. Emma arrived from Seattle with additional documentation that proved invaluable to the investigation. She had been collecting evidence of our parents' financial crimes for several years, hoping that someday there would be an opportunity to hold them accountable for their actions. Her files included bank records, fraudulent documents, and correspondence that demonstrated a long history of financial manipulation and exploitation of family members. The evidence Emma provided included documentation of how Robert and Linda had systematically drained our grandmother's savings account during her final months of life. They had used a combination of forged signatures, unauthorized withdrawals, and manipulated power of attorney documents to steal nearly $40,000 from an elderly woman who trusted them to help manage her affairs. The money had been used to pay off their personal debts and finance a luxury vacation rather than covering grandmother's medical expenses as they had claimed. Similar patterns emerged in their treatment of Uncle Frank, who had been convinced to invest his retirement savings in what Robert had described as a guaranteed real estate investment opportunity. The investment had been entirely fictitious, with Robert and Linda simply stealing Frank's money while providing him with fake documentation about the supposed returns on his investment. Frank had lost his life savings and had been forced to continue working well past retirement age to survive financially. Dr. Gregory Walsh's involvement in the conspiracy was thoroughly documented through recorded phone conversations and email communications that Rachel Kim had obtained through legal channels. Dr. Walsh had explicitly agreed to provide a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation that would support the guardianship petition in exchange for a fee of $5,000. The conversations revealed that he had never examined me and had no legitimate medical basis for his planned conclusions about my mental capacity. The recordings also captured Dr. Walsh providing detailed instructions to my parents about how to create evidence of my supposed mental incapacity. He had advised them to document incidents where I appeared confused, emotional, or unable to make decisions even if they had to exaggerate or fabricate such incidents. He had also suggested that they could claim my pain medications were affecting my judgment, despite the fact that my medical records showed I was taking only minimal pain relief medication and was clearly mentally competent. Federal investigators were particularly interested in the connection between my parents and Titan Industrial Equipment representatives. The investigation revealed that Titan had been systematically identifying accident victims whose families might be vulnerable to financial manipulation and had been offering payments to family members who could convince victims to accept reduced settlements. Amanda Foster, the Titan representative who had visited me in the hospital, had been in regular contact with my parents since shortly after the accident occurred. Phone records showed dozens of calls between Amanda and my parents during which they had discussed strategies for convincing me to accept a settlement offer that was substantially below the actual value of my claims. Titan had apparently offered to pay my parents a percentage of any savings they achieved by convincing me to settle for less than the full value of my case. This arrangement constituted criminal conspiracy to commit fraud on multiple levels. Titan was attempting to manipulate victims through their own family members, while my parents were betraying their fiduciary duty to act in my best interests. The scheme also involved mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges that carried substantial federal penalties. The medical evidence of my mental competency was overwhelming and completely contradicted the claims in the guardianship petition. Dr. Michael Chen's comprehensive evaluation had documented normal cognitive function, appropriate decision-making capacity, and complete mental competency. Additional evaluations by independent psychiatrists confirmed these findings and established that I had no mental health issues that would justify guardianship proceedings. My physical recovery was also progressing better than anyone had initially expected. Marcus's physical therapy program had been highly effective, and I was now able to walk short distances without assistance and had regained most of my normal mobility. The titanium hardware in my pelvis was functioning well, and my doctors expected me to eventually return to full physical capacity, though construction work would probably not be advisable due to the risk of re-injuring the area. The legal strategy developed by David and the federal prosecutors involved allowing my parents to proceed with their scheme while documenting every aspect of their criminal activity. This required me to continue appearing cooperative while secretly recording their conversations and providing evidence to investigators. The goal was to build an overwhelming case that would result in serious criminal penalties and would deter similar schemes targeting other victims. The most challenging aspect of this period was maintaining emotional equilibrium while watching my own parents actively conspire to steal money that represented compensation for my pain and suffering. The betrayal was profound and personally devastating, but I was sustained by the knowledge that exposing their crimes would protect other potential victims and would ensure that justice was ultimately served. Patricia provided crucial emotional support during this period, helping me understand that my parents' behavior reflected their own moral failures rather than any shortcoming on my part. She explained that children of manipulative parents often struggle with guilt and self-blame even when they are clearly the victims of exploitation. Her guidance helped me maintain focus on protecting myself and others rather than trying to understand or rationalize my parents' motivations. The investigation also revealed that several other families of accident victims had been approached by similar schemes involving family members working with corporate representatives to reduce settlement amounts. Federal investigators were building cases against multiple individuals and companies involved in what appeared to be a systematic effort to defraud accident victims across several states. Emma's presence in Phoenix provided invaluable support during this difficult period. She had taken time off from her job in Seattle to help coordinate the legal response and provide emotional support during the most challenging phase of the investigation. Her first-hand knowledge of our parents' history was crucial in helping investigators understand their methods and motivations. The timeline for resolving the situation was becoming clearer as the investigation progressed. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for the following month, which would provide an opportunity to present evidence of my mental competency while simultaneously exposing the fraudulent nature of the petition. Federal prosecutors were coordinating their criminal charges to coincide with the civil proceedings, ensuring that my parents would face immediate consequences for their actions. The coordinated legal response to my parents' scheme began with a carefully orchestrated series of court filings and law enforcement actions that would expose their criminal conspiracy while protecting my interests and those of other potential victims. David had worked with federal prosecutors to time these actions for maximum impact and to ensure that all evidence was properly preserved for criminal proceedings. The first major action was David's comprehensive response to the guardianship petition, which included extensive medical documentation of my mental competency, evidence of my parents' fraudulent activities, and recordings of their conversations revealing their true motivations. The filing also included testimony from Emma Patricia, Dr. Michael Chen, and several other professionals who could attest to my cognitive abilities and decision-making capacity. Judge Barbara Chen, who was assigned to the guardianship case, was known for her expertise in elder abuse and financial exploitation cases. She had extensive experience identifying fraudulent guardianship petitions and was particularly sensitive to schemes involving family members attempting to exploit vulnerable relatives. Judge Chen immediately recognized the suspicious elements of my parents' petition and ordered an emergency hearing to address the allegations of fraud and abuse. The hearing took place on a Wednesday morning in downtown Phoenix, with my parents arriving confident that their scheme would succeed. They had prepared elaborate testimony about my supposed mental incapacity and had brought Dr. Gregory Walsh to provide expert testimony supporting their claims. However, they were completely unprepared for the evidence that David and the federal prosecutors would present. Judge Chen began the hearing by noting the unusual circumstances of the case and the serious allegations that had been raised about the legitimacy of the guardianship petition. She explained that the court had received substantial evidence suggesting that the petition contained false statements and that the proposed guardians might not be acting in my best interests. David's presentation of evidence was systematic and devastating. He began by playing recordings of my parents' conversations, where they explicitly discussed their plans to steal my settlement money and their arrangements with Dr. Walsh to provide fraudulent medical testimony. The recordings clearly demonstrated that their concern for my welfare was entirely fabricated and that their true motivation was financial gain. The medical evidence of my competency was overwhelming. Dr. Michael Chen testified that his comprehensive evaluation had found no evidence of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. He explained that my decision-making abilities were completely intact and that I had been managing complex medical and legal decisions throughout my recovery period. Additional testimony from Marcus, Janet, and Patricia confirmed that I had demonstrated normal mental function during all my interactions with medical professionals. Dr. Gregory Walsh's attempted testimony collapsed immediately when David presented evidence of his history of providing fraudulent medical evaluations and his explicit agreement to provide false testimony in exchange for payment. Judge Chen was visibly angry when she learned that Dr. Walsh had planned to testify about my mental capacity without ever having examined me or reviewed my medical records. The most dramatic moment of the hearing occurred when federal agents entered the courtroom to arrest Dr. Walsh on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and providing false testimony in legal proceedings. His arrest in the middle of the hearing sent a clear message about the seriousness of the criminal charges and the federal government's commitment to prosecuting these crimes. Emma's testimony provided crucial context about our parents' history of financial exploitation and manipulation. She detailed their systematic abuse of elderly relatives, their pattern of financial fraud, and their history of using legal processes to steal money from vulnerable family members. Her testimony established that their current scheme was not an isolated incident, but part of a long-term pattern of criminal behavior. The evidence of my parents' identity theft and fraudulent credit applications was presented through testimony from Rachel Kim, who had documented their systematic use of my personal information to obtain loans and credit cards without my knowledge or consent. Bank records showed that they had stolen several $1,000s through these fraudulent accounts and had made no effort to repay the money. Perhaps most damaging was the evidence of their collaboration with Titan Industrial Equipment to reduce my settlement amount in exchange for personal payments. Amanda Foster, who had been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation with federal investigators, testified that Titan had specifically targeted victims' family members as a strategy for minimizing settlement costs. She described her meetings with my parents and their explicit agreement to convince me to accept a reduced settlement in exchange for a percentage of the savings. Judge Chen's ruling was swift and comprehensive. She immediately dismissed the guardianship petition with prejudice, finding that it had been filed in bad faith and contained numerous false statements. She also issued restraining orders, preventing my parents from accessing my financial accounts' medical records or legal communications. Additionally, she referred the case to law enforcement agencies for criminal prosecution and ordered my parents to immediately cease any contact with me except through their attorneys. The federal criminal charges were filed simultaneously with the guardianship hearing. Robert and Linda were arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud identity theft, wire fraud, mail fraud, and elder abuse. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison and substantial financial penalties. Dr. Walsh was charged with providing false testimony conspiracy to commit fraud and practicing medicine without proper credentials. Titan Industrial Equipment faced additional federal charges related to their systematic scheme to defraud accident victims through family manipulation. Amanda Foster and several other company executives were charged with conspiracy fraud and violation of federal regulations governing insurance settlements. The company also faced substantial civil penalties and regulatory sanctions that could affect their ability to continue operating in the construction industry. The media coverage of the case was extensive as it represented a significant federal prosecution of schemes targeting accident victims and their families. News stories focused on the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy and the vulnerability of people recovering from serious injuries. The coverage helped raise awareness about these types of exploitation schemes and encouraged other victims to report similar experiences to law enforcement. My role in the proceedings required me to testify about my parents' actions and their impact on my recovery process. This testimony was emotionally difficult but necessary to ensure that justice was served and that other potential victims were protected. Speaking publicly about my parents' betrayal was painful, but the recordings and documentation made their guilt undeniable. The criminal trial took place 6 months later, with my parents facing overwhelming evidence of their guilt. The recorded conversations, financial documents, and testimony from multiple witnesses left no doubt about their intentions and actions. Their defense attorneys were unable to present any credible explanation for their behavior or challenge the extensive evidence against them. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Robert and Linda were sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. They were also ordered to pay full restitution for their identity theft and fraudulent activities, though their lack of assets made recovery unlikely. Dr. Walsh received a 10-year sentence due to his history of similar crimes and his professional obligations as a physician. His medical license was permanently revoked, and he was banned from providing any form of medical testimony or consultation. The severity of his sentence was intended to deter other medical professionals from participating in similar schemes. Titan Industrial Equipment reached a settlement agreement that included substantial criminal penalties, regulatory sanctions, and changes to their business practices. The company was required to pay $15 million in criminal fines and was placed under federal oversight to ensure compliance with settlement regulations. Several company executives received prison sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years. The resolution of the criminal cases against my parents and their accomplices marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one defined by justice recovery and the opportunity to build genuine relationships based on trust and mutual respect, rather than exploitation and manipulation. The contrast between the darkness of betrayal and the light of eventual justice created a profound appreciation for the people who had supported me during my most difficult period. The civil lawsuit against Titan Industrial Equipment proceeded to a successful conclusion 8 months after the criminal convictions. The evidence of their criminal conspiracy to defraud accident victims had severely damaged their legal position and made a favorable settlement inevitable. The final settlement amount of $15 million exceeded even David's most optimistic projections and provided comprehensive compensation for my medical expenses, lost wages, permanent disability, and pain and suffering. The settlement also included substantial punitive damages designed to deter similar corporate misconduct in the future. Titan's systematic scheme to exploit accident victims through their own family members represented a particularly egregious form of corporate negligence that the court wanted to punish severely. The size of the settlement sent a clear message to other companies about the serious financial consequences of attempting to defraud injured workers and their families. My physical recovery progressed better than anyone had initially expected. The combination of excellent medical care, dedicated physical therapy with Marcus, and the motivation provided by the legal victory had enabled me to regain nearly full mobility and strength. While I would never be able to return to heavy construction work due to the risk of re-injuring my pelvis, I had discovered new career possibilities that were both personally fulfilling and financially rewarding. The experience of navigating complex legal and medical systems during my recovery had revealed aptitudes and interests that I had never previously explored. Working with David federal investigators and victim advocates had introduced me to the field of legal advocacy and victim services. I decided to pursue formal education in this area, using a portion of my settlement to fund law school with a focus on personal injury law and victim advocacy. Emma had decided to relocate from Seattle to Phoenix, permanently strengthening our relationship and providing the family connection that our parents had never offered. She had been profoundly affected by witnessing the extent of Robert and Linda's manipulation and wanted to ensure that we maintained the close bond we had developed during the crisis. Emma found a position with a nonprofit organization that provided services to victims of domestic violence and financial abuse. The foundation I established with a portion of my settlement became a significant focus of my new life direction. The Merle Santos Foundation, named in honor of my deceased coworker Miguel Santos, provided legal assistance and advocacy services to construction workers and their families dealing with workplace injuries and related legal challenges. The foundation's services included help with insurance claims, legal referrals, financial planning assistance, and protection from exploitation by family members or corporate representatives. Through the foundation's work, I discovered that my experience with family exploitation was far more common than I had realized. The foundation received dozens of requests each month from accident victims who were facing similar schemes by relatives who viewed their settlements as opportunities for personal gain. The legal resources and investigative services we provided had helped protect numerous families from financial predators and had resulted in several additional criminal prosecutions. Marcus and I had developed a close friendship that extended beyond our original therapist-patient relationship. His guidance during my physical recovery had been crucial, but more importantly, his perspective as someone who had overcome serious trauma had provided valuable emotional support during the darkest periods of family betrayal. Marcus introduced me to his sister Jennifer, a social worker who specialized in helping trauma victims rebuild their lives after experiencing betrayal by trusted individuals. Jennifer and I discovered a natural compatibility based on shared experiences with trauma recovery and a mutual commitment to helping others navigate similar challenges. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully as both of us understood the importance of building trust gradually after experiencing significant betrayal. Jennifer's professional expertise in trauma recovery provided valuable insights into my own healing process, while my experience with legal advocacy complemented her social work practice. The criminal convictions of my parents had provided legal justice, but the emotional healing required more time and effort. Patricia continued to provide counseling and support as I worked through the complex feelings of grief, anger, and loss associated with accepting the reality that my parents were fundamentally selfish and manipulative people who were incapable of genuine love or concern for my welfare. The healing process involved recognizing that my lifelong attempts to earn their approval and affection had been futile because they were emotionally incapable of providing genuine parental support. This realization was simultaneously liberating and painful as it meant grieving the loss of parents I had never actually had while celebrating my freedom from their toxic influence. 2 years after their convictions, my parents attempted to contact me from federal prison, seeking money for their commissary accounts and legal fees for appeals they wanted to file. Their letters revealed no genuine remorse for their actions and continued to focus primarily on their own needs and desires. They claimed that their prosecution had been unfair and that they had only been trying to help me during my recovery. I chose not to respond to their communications or provide any financial support for their prison expenses. This decision was consistent with the healthy boundaries I had learned to establish and maintain with people who demonstrated patterns of exploitation and manipulation. Patricia had helped me understand that providing support to people who showed no genuine remorse would only enable their continued destructive behavior. The contrast between my parents' selfish manipulation and the genuine support I had received from people like Marcus, Emma, David, Patricia, and Jennifer highlighted the fundamental difference between authentic relationships and exploitative ones. True supporters had offered help without expecting anything in return, and had consistently prioritized my welfare over their own convenience or financial gain. My new career in legal advocacy had proven both personally fulfilling and professionally successful. After completing law school, I joined David's firm as a partner specializing in construction accident cases and victim advocacy. Our practice had expanded significantly, partly due to the reputation we had gained through my own case and the successful prosecution of the exploitation scheme. The Foundation's work had also expanded beyond individual case assistance to include advocacy for policy changes that would better protect accident victims from financial exploitation. We had worked with state legislators to strengthen guardianship laws, improve oversight of settlement processes, and create additional penalties for family members who attempted to exploit vulnerable relatives. 5 years after the accident that had nearly ended my life, I was able to reflect on the experience with genuine gratitude for the insights it had provided about human nature, the importance of authentic relationships, and the possibility of creating meaning from trauma. While I would never have chosen to experience such severe physical injuries or family betrayal, the crisis had ultimately led to a life that was more purposeful and fulfilling than anything I had previously imagined. The beeping monitors that had been my only company during those first weeks in the ICU had been replaced by the voices of people who genuinely cared about my welfare and wanted to support my success and happiness. The isolation and abandonment I had experienced during my recovery had given way to a rich network of personal and professional relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. The settlement money that my parents had tried to steal had instead become a resource for helping other victims and building a life dedicated to justice and service. Their betrayal had inadvertently led me to discover my true calling and had provided the motivation to pursue a career that made a meaningful difference in other people's lives. The most profound lesson from this experience was understanding that family relationships, like all relationships, must be based on genuine care and respect, rather than obligation or expectation. The people who had truly functioned as family during my crisis were those who had chosen to support me without any expectation of personal gain. Blood relationships that lacked these fundamental elements of genuine concern were ultimately meaningless and potentially dangerous. Looking back, I realized that the accident had been a catalyst for discovering truths about my life and relationships that I might never have faced under normal circumstances. The physical trauma had been severe, and the family betrayal had been devastating, but both had ultimately led to a life that was more authentic, purposeful, and fulfilling than the path I had been following before the crane collapsed. The foundation continues to grow, and each family we help represents an opportunity to prevent the kind of exploitation and betrayal that I experienced. Every successful case reminds me that suffering can be transformed into service, and that the worst human behavior can inspire the best human responses. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a situation where family members or people you trusted tried to take advantage of you during a vulnerable time? How did you protect yourself? And what advice would you give to others facing similar betrayals? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, or if you think it might help someone else who's dealing with exploitation by family members, please give this video a like and share it with others who might benefit from hearing about these experiences. Your support helps us reach more people who might need to know they're not alone in facing these challenges. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about overcoming adversity, finding justice, and building authentic relationships after betrayal. We share new stories every week about people who have faced difficult situations and emerged stronger. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community that believes in justice, authentic relationships, and the power of turning trauma into purpose. Remember that you deserve to be surrounded by people who genuinely care about your well-being, and never let anyone convince you that exploitation is the same as love. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember that your worth is not determined by what others can take from you, but by what you choose to give to the world.